Good evening, viewers, and a very warm welcome back to Candid Talk. It's been a while since we've done our last event, and today, interestingly, the roles are reversed. Khusru Irani, who is an architect, urban designer, philanthropist, and also the founder of the Loft, has very generously agreed to be my interlocutor for today's event. Just a quick one to call out that this particular episode is being presented to you by Prohor.in in collaboration with HarperCollins India and the Loft, which is what Khusru leads. So without further ado, Khusru, the floor is yours.
Hi, Avik. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening and welcome to your show. It's not often that you get to be a guest on your own show, so welcome. Your audience has been seeing you, for so many months, interviewing so many interesting people, and I'm sure they want to get to know you better. And I'm looking forward to this evening as well. At the outset, I'd like to thank my dear friend Ruby Lal. Ruby, if you're listening, thank you. Thank you for introducing me to Avik and Avik to me and making this happen. Since our first connection over WhatsApp and calls, Avik, we've gotten to know each other a little bit, and then I've gotten to know your work a lot more in the last few weeks since we decided to do this together. And I'll introduce Avik. This is an introduction to Avik for your audience. Avik Chanda has donned a range of roles in his career: corporate leader, change catalyst, business advisor and coach, best-selling author, columnist and evangelist for deploying positive psychology in the workplace, and more recently, an entrepreneur. He has a deep and sensitive understanding of globalized workplaces and cultural nuances, having worked across the US, Europe, UK, and India. He brings in this diverse experience to deliver insightful sessions on human dimension of technological disruption, future of work, conflict management and negotiation skills, teamwork, diversity, and inclusion. He is a visiting faculty at IIT Delhi and XLRI. Interestingly, Avik is also the author of 3 books, a novel, a business book, and a historical biography. He also writes poems and is also a painter. We will be talking so there's a lot to talk about, and a lot of this journey to share with us. I'm going to read an excerpt from your prologue from Darashiko, your most recent book.
Sure.
In a sense, wanting to start at the beginning. I have this distinct childhood memory, me, aged 6 or perhaps 7, seated beside Dadabai. Dadabai being your mother's grandfather and your great-grandfather. The two of us gazing out the window of his bedroom for a long time. He spoke not exactly of history, but of change. At an unobtrusive distance around us were shelves stretching from the floor to the ceiling, packed with books, both old and new, advising, educating, but also strangely reassuring, protecting us, a child and a man in his late 70s, from the perils of the world. History books. Avik, take us back to this time. What was it like? You was a young boy.
Yeah.
Growing up in Calcutta.
Yes, this was, right from the fact that the city itself was called Calcutta and not Kolkata. Everything was very different, right? It was a very, very so viewers, right? And many of you belong to the millennial generation or even younger. So this was before the technological revolution, which was way before the IT revolution. And Calcutta was, at that point of time, still very much the hub of learning and literature and books and culture and arts and so forth, right? We used to pride ourselves in calling this the intellectual capital of India. And things were laid back. You could work at your own pace if you wanted. You could not work at all and still somehow be able to etch out a living. And at that point of time, I think I had a very fortunate childhood, Khusru, in the sense that a number of my family members in the previous generations had been academics, had written had penned books, articles, even books of poems that I could count within the family. And therefore, it was always a treat to go with my parents to Dada Bhai's place. And I can remember my earliest visits, maybe when I was very, very small, when I could like barely speak, but I still have these sort of vague flashes that of being carried on somebody's shoulder, right, up the stairs, right, and just around the bend of the stairs there was a little pot with a cactus plant, and that cactus plant with its sort of prickly thorns sticking out seemed very scary, and it was always like the price of admission for me. I loved to be with Dada Bhai. I loved to be with his wife, who I'd call Borthamma, right, who died eventually at the age of about 99 or 100, just about touching 100. So every time there would be like a cross of emotions when I would go there. There is this great pleasure and this looking forward to be with them and to be regaled by their stories of their generation, particularly from Borthamma. She would talk to me for hours of her memories from the 1940s, 1930s, and even before that. But the cactus plant had to be traversed. That had to be negotiated. So every time it had to be that little fear you had to overcome in order to get to that greater goal. That is one thing that really sticks out in my mind. And oh yes, the books. I think more than anything else, my grandparents on both sides of the family, paternal as well as maternal, and later on my father, they introduced me to books and inculcated in me, the love of books, and by corollary, the love of all things unknown and new, love of learning, really.
Were these both in English and in Bengali, or so were you reading in
Yeah.
Bengali as well?
So here's the thing, right? When I was growing up, I had a reasonably decent memory, so I would cheat. So the thing was, I would have books like picture books being read out to me, and I would identify as to what text went with which picture. So that mapping was clear in my mind. So long before I could actually read, both in Bengali and in English, this happened with several books. And therefore, then I would put on a show whereby I would take the book and pretend to read, and it would be perfect, right? Because I knew the text for this particular picture is, picture of a king is this. Then the book with a picture of a tiger or a picture of a demon, some Rakshas, is that. And it would be fine. And people would be like, wow, this kid can read. And my parents knew the trick and I knew the trick. But yeah, but yes, when I could read, it would be both in English and in Bangla, but more English than Bangla, as I can remember.
Right. Because growing up, I just read in English, and it's nice when people read in their native tongue, and I think it adds so much more value. So then, tell us about Presidency College in Calcutta, and then going to Delhi and studying economics.
Right. See, at that point of time, right, it was suddenly, I wouldn't say suddenly, but it was kind of cool for a reasonably bright person not to do engineering, because this was the norm, right? You did your engineering and then you went ahead and did your MBA. So, right, if you were in Kolkata, so it had to be like an Jadavpur University, or it had to be like an IIT Kharagpur or Kanpur in case you got through that, and thence to the IM, and thence to a glorious career in the corporate sector, right? That was kind of the norm. But every now and then, we also did have quite a few people doing, going into academia, studying economics or physics or history or English, etc. And one of the things I think at that point of time, which motivated me to take up economics, is that on my mother's side, my mother's uncle, so in fact, Dada Bhai's son, youngest son, who unfortunately passed away from cancer at a very, very early age, he was a professor of developmental economics at Presidency College. And somewhere maybe at the back of my mind was like, okay, so he's no longer there, but let me try and get that kind of an ambience. And I think Presidency, which was still a college, not a university, I think I got that tail bit of the stalwarts who had been there all the way from the 70s and 80s, right? And had made that into the glorious institution that it then was. I caught the back end of it. I was very fortunate that across disciplines we had really, really famous professors who had either moved on, who had retired, but would still come in and teach as Professor Emeritus, or who had moved on to other institutes, but would still come in and do guest lectures with us. So Professor Deepak Banerjee, who incidentally was the father of the Nobel laureate Avijit Vinayak Banerjee. So he was our professor. He taught us microeconomics. And there was Mihir Rokhit, who was then with the Indian Statistical Institute, but he would still come over and teach us from time to time. Anup Sinha, who had then moved on to IMC, would come back and talk to us. And, just think about it, right? 18, 19-year-olds and Anup Sinha coming, and very flamboyant young professor, and talking to you and say, go beyond your curriculum, go beyond your books, and, challenge yourself. And all right, so E.H. Carr's What is History, or Hobsbawm for that matter, and so forth. Right. So it was very exciting time. The only thing for me was that I purported to study economics, and I ended up reading and studying just about everything else but that.
That usually happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, which I think kind of caught up with me when I went to Delhi. And then after my master's, right, it kind of dawned on me that I probably did not have the kind of, and at that point of time, right, the kind of stasis and the kind of, I wouldn't say talent, but just the grit to go through a very long and arduous, at the very least, a 5-year sort of PhD program. And then I said, all right, that was like a little period when I was exploring, euphemism for drifting, and trying to find my feet, and just saying, okay, in while I'm still thinking about what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I was then 23, turning 24. Looking at opportunities in the corporate world, etc. Yeah.
And then I understand you spent a lot of time in the consulting world, business world, working for Deloitte and PwC, and spending a lot of time all over the world. So tell us a little bit about that. How did that start, and how did that journey begin?
Right. So I had, before joining PwC, that this is late 96, early 97-ish, right? Fair bit ago. I did a very, very short stint at The Statesman, which at that point of time was still quite good, like many other things in Kolkata. And I was a newsroom editor. So at that point of time, it was way, way, way before the fancy stuff that you have in terms of the page makers and everything being done digitally and online publishing. So everything literally was like done by hand. Even the bromides had to be like stuck onto the dummy and make sure that the positioning is correct, and that goes into printing press. So that was a very different kind of a feel. And the reason why I talk about this is this had a lot to do. This was the kind of experience that I was recreating when I, like decades later, wrote the first novel, Anchor. So it was the newsroom experience and working the night shifts and being in the newsroom. That was very interesting. And I did that for about 5 or 6 months. And because I had studied economics, and at that point of time, a lot of changes were happening, right? So liberalization had come in from 91 onwards. But in 96, 97, many of the sectors, the big public sectors, electricity being one of them, had started to open up slowly, one by one. And one of these was the Orissa State Electricity Board. I still remember it's called, and they transformed it something called Gridco. And at that point, I said, all right, so maybe this is something that I might want to be involved in, because at the back end of it, it's economics, right? So from public sector to private sector to public sector, and vice versa, or a PPP kind of a thing. What does it entail? And can I bring, some of my fledgling sort of expertise and education? And of course, it had a lot to do with report writing. And I said, all right, I can edit, I can write. I have a background in economics, was trained once upon a time. So that's the job that and PwC was PW'd. So this was before Coopers & Lybrand merger with Pricewaterhouse. So PW, Pricewaterhouse Associates, to be correct, PWA, was doing this project. And I said, all right, can I be part of that team? So that was what I had in mind. And then the person who interviewed me, Ambarish Dashgupta, turned out to be a technocrat. And he said, Avik, we can always put you in there later, but what's your idea about ERP? And I was like, I vaguely know about it. Okay, what do you think about SAP? And I've heard the name SAP. I don't know what the full form is. I just know it's a German company and it's international and it's very big and chic and everything else. And he said, you know what? And this was the guy's foresight. He said, the next, not just the next few years, but the next few decades are really going to belong to IT, information technology. So think about it. If you want a career in information technology, why don't you get started here? And at a future point of time, if you want to sort of change tracks and go over to the other sort of vertical and do projects for the government, or do projects in the energy sector, or working with different public sector enterprises, you can always do that. And me being lazy, right? That never happened. I was just phenomenally lazy. But I think part of that was just luck. Part of that was really luck. At that point of time, you know what the joke was? The joke was that with all of these guys, and this is the late 90s, the heyday of the IT revolution, the joke was that in front of all these large offices, the Pricewaterhouse and the other big five, and the TCS and IBM, etc. The joke was that you have a huge placard saying "Trespassers beware!" exclamation mark. Trespassers will be recruited, right? So yeah. So I was one of those trespassers who was recruited.
Brilliant, brilliant. And that work and those jobs took you, I understand, all over the world. And how many years, or what was that journey like? Where did you spend your time, and what kind of things were you doing in that phase of your life?
I mean, looking back, right, I think the best thing that happened for me in terms of consulting, right, it's multiple things actually. So number one was travel. So even within India, I was traveling all the time, right? If I wasn't just sitting down in Calcutta or in Delhi or in any one particular place and then just going into office. The best thing was, even within India, I was moving around, and I was moving to places away from the town. So there was a project that we did for Grasim Cement, right? And the nearest dot on the map was Raipur. So we got off on the station there, the entire team, and thence the jeep, and it was an open jeep, and it was the height of summer. I had a lot of hair cover back then, so that was a saving grace. But notwithstanding, they have this term called Nortapa. So Nortapa is like 9 days of heat in that place, and it literally goes to 45 degrees, 47 degrees, 48 degrees. Open jeep, no cover, right? That came to pick us in. So three of us got down with our luggage, and then we are taken to the township, right? Through very, very hot, reddish, brackish, sort of brambly, arid land, right? Into that factory, which was the township in itself. Very different kinds of expertise, right? Experiences in life. So cut forward to the next one is when we are working with Reliance. So we are at Churchgate, or we are at Nariman Point, and they're plush, plum corporate offices, and that's and they've consultants from all across the world, right? And I've just learned a smattering. I've done like a 6-month course in German, and suddenly I've people from SAP coming from Germany, and I'm trying to just brush up and impress them with 2 bits of German that I can speak. That was the kind of thing. So even within India, that was the kind of experience that I had. And then beyond, yes, my first stint was in Europe. So that was in Germany for about 2 years, but that was a global team. So we had about 200 plus people from a project standpoint between the consultants and the client organization. And although we were based out of Germany, the rollout was across Europe. So again, travel. So, experiences, travel, you see different people from across cultures, and you can really, really, and at that point of time, I was still fairly young and very, very curious, very, very open-minded, and just like very curious about the world. So just immersing myself in that journey, right? I mean, the thing is, right, things like with the Germans, you should never, I mean, you might prove me otherwise, but with the Germans, the Irish, the Russians, Scandinavians, never ever try to take them on a drinking match when you're in a pub with them. And I learned that very early on. And I said, all right, you know what? But I am a meat person, and I can have a lot of meat even now. And I was like, all right, you know what? They're having a lot of beer, and I'm going to challenge them with the meat part. They're drinking like 1.5 liters or 2 liters of beer, and I'm consuming half a liter, right? And then going to the washroom. And then when I'm back, I am on. and I can have a Schweinehaxe, right, which is like 500 grams of meat, and they'll be looking at this, and I was really scrawny. Who's this guy from the tropics, like scrawny, like, weighing 60 kilos, 5'8", having a Schweinehaxe? So yeah. So that was what it was like.
Yeah, amazing. Tell me, your business and your work in consulting has been a formative part of your life and your experience, and it has shaped who you are today, your writing, um, your future work, which we're going to talk about. Who were some of the mentors that you had at that time, and do you have any memories that you can bring up about people who shaped you, who influenced you, and in what way?
Oh, a lot of them, really. I mean, I think the first thing that they taught me, from someone, because I was working in technology and I'm not an engineer. I was working in technology, and I didn't code at that point of time, and I still can't code, right? So I had this little, I wouldn't say inferiority complex, but little sort of grain of doubt in my mind, saying, okay, am I really cut out for this job? Am I really there? And a lot of my mentors, for example, Ambrita, back in the day, and then when I went to Deloitte, a lot of people, both here and abroad, they told me, look, if your strength is understanding the problems of people, if your strength is just the fact, I mean, I'm gabbing on now, but I am capable of being a good listener as well. So just listening to people and processing that in, and resisting the urge to just give solutions, that is, if not half the journey, that's at least 10% of the journey, because you're hearing them out, and therefore you're going to get much better at really processing them and using those as determinants when you're trying to give solutions later on, right? So focusing on the behavioral skills, I think that was a huge learning that I had back in the day. And if I tie that with even the work that I'm doing today, whether that's moderating sessions here, or whether that's writing bylines, writing the next book, which requires talking to a lot of people, definitely the startup, definitely the clients whom I'm advising today on a virtual or remote, like over the screen, like we're talking now. A lot of that has to do with behavioral attributes, and I think this entire journey of mine, these 20 years, definitely helped sharpen that. So, I mean, what was the casualty in all of this? The casualty was definitely the technology part, right? Because if it's starting off by doing a lot of technology, and then sooner rather than later, I was doing like project planning. So it was like a lot of spreadsheets and Microsoft projects. And then beyond that, I'm still sprouting technology and terms and jargons. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm just talking to people. And that's when I thought, you know what, this is probably the part that I'm actually better at, right? Because I was spending more time recruiting people and coaching and counseling and building competencies and talking to peers and juniors from a client standpoint than I was doing actual technology. I never did coding or code review, but really going very deep into the technology. And I think that helped bring about a shift, sort of, I think it indicated, which I didn't really see it as that, but it kind of indicated the shift that my career was going to take later.
And I think that's reflected. I think that sort of perceptiveness, that understanding of human psychology is then seen in your later work. And I'm gonna sort of zoom ahead, because there's so much to cover, and I don't want to miss on the things that I want us to talk about. And something brought you back to Calcutta many years later, and I'm going to quote a little bit once more from the prologue of Darashiko. Looking back, it seems only natural that my steps would bring me back, at least for a while, to Calcutta, where I had spent the first 20 odd years of my life. Notwithstanding a formal reappellation of its name, changing political regimes, evidence of globalization, the rampant pulling down of buildings that ought to have been designated as heritage, to be supplanted by mini malls and squat 5 or 6 and 6-story structures completely devoid of identity, there were still some things about it that remained Calcutta. And I'm assuming that once you return to Calcutta many years later,
Mhm.
is when you started your journey with books. I mean, is that right? Is that correct to say that?
So actually, the journey with books had started from maybe 2000, 2001 onwards, because I was living in England back in the day. I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then again
Yeah.
with Deloitte. So the two sort of stints. Um, and at that point of time, as many of my peers in Bengal would know, I had the poetry fit. So I was writing poems, right? And again, I was in the right place at the right time, because the UK, even today, is probably one of the last bastions of that sort of old world civilization, which still think that the power of words is important, the power of verse is very important. The still, and at that point, I'm talking about 18, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, the Arts Council would work with the sort of smaller publishers, the niche literary journals, and help them sustain their business. So what I was doing was, I had a day job, and after that, I would just write in poems, and sooner or later, and just start sending them out, and then sooner or later, I got lucky, because they started to get published, and a couple of years down the line, I had enough to be able to sort of pluck courage and go to a publisher in the UK and say, hey, you know what, I've had these kind of publications, would you like to take out a collection? And there was a friend of mine whom I actually got to know through the publisher, and her collection, Tupa Snyder, her collection had come out first. And then a year later, this was Sharesman in the UK, based out of Exeter at that point of time, Tony Fraser. He very generously said, yes, Avik, we'll take out your collection. That was 2006. And then 2008. So these two were like poetry collections. And then there was a hiatus. But you're right. Around the time, or to nearer the time, when I was shifting out from being an employee, right, in the giant corporate sector, to sort of being on my own, that's when the novel came about, because the novel was published very early. I think just at the end of 2014, or early Jan 2015.
So let's dive into your first book, and it's
Okay.
called Anchor, published in 2015 by HarperCollins. And so, what inspired you, prompted you to write a novel? I mean, it's it's not everybody just doesn't get up one day and say, okay, we're going to write a novel. So what was it? Was there a story inside you that was dying to come out? What was that
Right.
phase of your life?
Okay, so this was so this novel, if I remember correctly, was actually written back in 20 through 2011, 2012, while I was in England, in the UK, doing a stint with Deloitte, right? And at that point of time, I think one of the things which often happens to many people is that when you're working abroad, or you're living abroad, you tend to get drawn to happenings which are going on in your country, right? And sometimes vice versa. So right now in India, right, I'm switching on BBC and CNN most of the time, and trying to figure out what's going to happen in the upcoming November election. But one of the things that had struck in my mind was the entire incident that happened in Nondigram. And this is something that I was not in India at that point of time, but one would get it, because by the time the news would start to flow, and it was online. So the entire thing around the land grabbing and the nexus between the powers that be, and the lawmaking authorities and the police force, and goons and underworlds, literally just grabbing over a large tract of land, a village plus some area, in order to turn that into an industrial township, and not really compensating the farmers or the agriculturists or anything. That was a huge, huge, huge problem back in the day. It escalated into violence. There was, after that, a kind of committee that had been set up, the Judiciary Committee, which probed it. And it was one of the things, one of the several things that was instrumental in bringing down the previous regime. So that incident, or that series of incidents, resonated in my mind. It still remained in my mind. And then when I came back to India, or even before that, what I was doing was, I was trying to figure out because I'd been in Statesman and I knew a few people in the media, not just in Statesman but in Telegraph and elsewhere, who had actually been there, who had been stopped by the police or had managed to break through the cordon, actually covered that event while it was happening, or visited the farmers who had been injured in the lathi charge or in the firing later on at the field hospitals, and had got their stories. And I got in touch and I started to sort of farm my earlier network and say, look, this is something that I'm interested in, that I want to write about. And they said, an article? I said, no, possibly a book. And they said, are you sure? I said, look, I'm going to change the names. I'm even going to change the time in which it happens. I'm going to move out the time frame by like a good decade, right? So it happened in 2007, 2008-ish. I took it back to end of the last part of the 1990s. But I do want to do this book because for me, the interest was I could use this to have maybe, capsule all of this into one night, the journey of one particular night, and what's happening in the newsroom, what's happening to the journalists there who are waiting for the story to come in from the field, what's actually happening to the other people who have gone out there to cover from the field. And you juxtapose that with several other sort of subplots across the other different kind of sort of antagonistic characters taking part in that whole drama that unfolds throughout the night. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. It's just rambling.
I'm just thinking that you brought in your passion for your state, understanding of politics at that time, the persecution that was going on, or your view of those incidents, your journalistic skills, and put it in, instead of writing articles in the papers, maybe you or in magazines, you brought it out as a novel. I mean, that's an interesting way of responding to an inner calling, if you would say. What was the experience of writing the novel like? Did it live up? Were you having any expectations from that experience, or
not really? I was just doing it for a lark. I was just doing it for the joy of it. And at that point of time, I did not have a publisher. I certainly did not have an agent back in the day, and I just did it out of pure sort of joy of writing that, and just the joy of seeing something coming into being from nothing, right? Which happens to everyone and anyone who's doing anything creative, even curating an event, for example. And so this is what happened. I took about 6-7 months to write the main draft, but the way that it started is that there's this person who is now in Penguin, but at that point of time was at HarperCollins, Shantanu Roy Chaudhary, Shantanu Da. And he had been one of the people who had been instrumental in sort of supporting and really sort of patronizing the poetry that I was writing earlier. Because back in the day, around 2007, 8, 9, 10, around that time, every year, Penguin India would bring out an anthology called, and they used to call it proofs, first proofs, second proofs, third proofs, etc. Right? And that one of them, the first proofs, I remember, he did a selection from my collection of footnotes, and he published that in that anthology. And then I went back to Shantanu Da and I said, okay, so I'm working on some new poems. Would you like to, maybe sort of compile them into an anthology, into a collection and publish, etc. And he said, do you like to write? Do you like fiction? Do you read fiction? I said, yes. And do you want to do fiction? I said, yes. So he said, okay, why don't you give me just in an email, maybe 2 or 3 ideas, and then we'll take it on from there. So I gave him a couple of ideas. I can't remember what the second one was. And then he honed in on this one, and on Anchor. It had the name Anchor. And he said, okay, I like that one. Why don't you give me 30 pages? And so I wrote up 30 pages and I sent that to him. And by that time, I'd already gone to the UK and I was just like settling in. And as many of you who know what it's like to have all of these, flip-flops from one geography, one sort of time zone to another, it's not just the time zone that you need to adjust to, but the pace of life, the working style, the ethos, the culture, the people, everything else, right? And I'd absolutely forgotten about it. And lo and behold, like 4 or 5 weeks later, in comes this email from Shantanu saying, yeah, I like this. Just write the rest of the manuscript. So brilliant. I got lucky. I just got lucky.
Brilliant. your next book is a business book, and it's called From Command to Empathy: Using EQ in the Age of Disruption, again by HarperCollins, and advocating the need for greater emotional enablement in the Indian workplace. So this talks about use of psychology, relationships, empathy, and this is something that empathy seems to be a theme not just in your work but also a theme in recent business culture. Ray Dalio talks about radical honesty. Gary Vee talks about being happy, and
Satya Nadella says in the long term, EQ will trump IQ, and so forth.
yeah,
Yeah.
or culture will eat, strategy for breakfast, all that. So these are a lot of this is happening in business speak and business business books and the business world. Why do you feel that empathy is important, especially in the workplace? Isn't it that nice guys finish last? Isn't that the saying? So how do you counter that?
I think there's a fundamental problem with the way many of the large corporates tend to think and work. Of course, the current circumstances are forcing us to sort of revisit our entire rubric of the entire processes, policies, procedures by which business operations function. But if you go back maybe a few years, right, and you look at the Indian workplace and beyond, we had come a long way. We, as in collectively, all the corporates, all the businesses had come a very long way in terms of tools, processes, methodology, technology. Certainly technology, right? You'd gone from the punching machines, and you'd gone from like data cards being fed in a very, very short period of time, just a very few decades, into a scenario that's characterized by IoT, Internet of Things, right? And things are connected, and a lot of things are starting to be automated. That's all great. But my experience, my feeling, and my conviction is that we have done this at the expense of emotional connect at all levels, between ourselves, between colleagues, between peers, between juniors and seniors, and it seeps into every stream, every sphere of life. And I've seen this. I've faced this as well, and I've been on both sides of the table, so to speak, right? So when I started to have that self-awareness, I kind of told myself, yes, this is a problem. One of the main problems with that is the world has moved on, and the sensibilities of people, particularly from a demographic standpoint, if I'm comparing my generation, which is like mid-late 40s and beyond, to the millennials, let alone the Gen Z, right? The orientation, the way of thinking is completely different. Like, for instance, in the workplace, there is no way that millennials are going to wear it, the old typical command center style of an assembly line when I dictate and you have to do that. And I've seen that from my personal experience, that it does not work. What does work is when you give them the time and you can mentor them and you can shape their thoughts. They don't want to be patronized, right? They want to be mentored. They want to be coached. They want to be counseled. They want to be led by example. They want to be motivated. They want to be inspired. They do not want to be dictated to. I mean, you do that, you're looking at a lot of attrition on your hands in the team. And they will be very vocal about it, right? So it's a shift of the times. It's a shift of the work ethos. It's a shift of the demographics. And that is why I think the old style of working just does not function. It does not hold water anymore. And it has to be, I mean, empathy is, again, one word which stands for a huge number of things if you break it down, like psychologically, right? It's just putting yourself out there and being more open-minded, being more mindful, being more curious, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes cognitively, effectively, and just having deeper associations and relationships in the workplace and beyond.
I mean, human psychology, I think, is a critical. It's critical to understand psychology and to use it in daily life. Not just in business relationships, personal relationships, all kinds of. I mean, I think psychology is so important, and I think it can't be emphasized enough. One more question from this sort of part of your work. If you were to pick one key principle from your book, or one piece of advice to entrepreneurs today, what would it be?
I think to entrepreneurs today, it would be all right. So I'll give you the short answer first, right, and then slightly longer one, right? The first is you have to build resilience. Okay, you have to be resilient in these present times. I think that's a no-brainer. Anyone and everybody, I think, would kind of agree with that. Now, here's the important thing. Here's the interesting thing, right? You can't build resilience by taking people through a very intensive crash course for 6 weeks and say, this is it. This is a framework for resilience. 101, 102, 103, 201, 202, 203, semester 1, semester 2, semester 3, right? This is your workbook. This is your example. This is your case study. You sit for an exam, you get your certificate. You are now resilience certified. It doesn't work like that. So it's a question of delving deeper. And this is where, a large number of researchers and analysts, for example, someone like Barbara Fredrickson, she's built up this entire model called broaden and build. And what she's saying is, look at the positive emotions that we all intrinsically possess to a greater or lesser degree. You're looking at hope, optimism, gratitude, love, sense of fulfillment, of wonder, right? Of appreciation of things around you, appreciation of beauty, culture, love of learning, etc. Right? If you can hone these, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of conscious effort on an individual's part, then as a byproduct of that, without even trying, you will have resilience to stress. You will develop grit. You will have greater self-esteem. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So resilience, one word, but to build that.
Well said. Well said. Your third book, again, sort of jumping genres. I really, really do not know how you do it, but the third book is Dara Shuko, The Man Who Would Be King, published in 2019. And I'm really curious about this sort of recent phenomenon, especially in India. There are a lot of what you would call classical historians, academic historians, like Ruby Lal, for example, who are now writing or working in history and making a serious effort to do it. There's my dear friend Dr. Uday Kulkarni in Pune, who's written a multiple number of books, whose new book is coming out on Sunday. It's already available on Amazon. He's a surgeon. He's a medical surgeon, worked many years, and then decided to write history, and doing a phenomenal job of it. You have a background in business, in consulting. So why history? What was it that drew you to history? And what is it? Why is it so important for us to be looking at history? Firstly, your personal story with history, and why do you think we should be looking at history?
Absolutely. Just before I get there, maybe it's important to mention, because you talked about Ruby, right? And I think it's also fair to say that more and more really top-notch academic historians are finding it useful, are finding it beneficial, and finding it important to write history for the general discerning reader as well. In her day job, Ruby Lal does very, very specialized niche historical work that is grounded in a particular framework, right? But when she's writing Empress, the tone, the diction, the narrative style, everything changes, right? So she's really reaching out and she's able to connect with the discerning reader. So, for example, someone like Professor Dipesh Chakraborty, University of Chicago, when he's writing a book on climate change or the history of climate change, it's an intensively sort of deeply researched academic, and he himself calls it a heavy book. It's a tome in all senses of the word, right? But when he's writing about one of the stalwart historians of the early first part of the 20th century, Sir Jodhanath Sarkar, and he's writing a book about him and taking him as a protagonist to talk about historiography in the 20th century, right? Which is the calling of history, Sir Jodhanath Sarkar and his Empire of Truth. You should see the language. There is lyricism in the language. It parts of it reads like prose poem, parts of it reads like a memoir, parts of it reads like a biography, and underlying it all is that deep sort of commitment to historiography, which has never left Dipesh Da, right? I think that is incredibly important, and I think more and more senior, seasoned academics are finding it useful to reach out to readers and explain to them what history really means. In my case, right, what drew me to history is, of course, the relationship to Dada Bhai, who was an academic historian, and there have been various other people in the family who have been either academic historians or have studied history in colleges and universities. For example, my mother studied history, and my maternal grandfather also studied history. So that's like 3 or 4 generations, at least 5 actually, who had either studied history or worked on history, even if they hadn't studied it. The way this particular book came about is after the business book was published, and it did reasonably well, right? What happens to any kind of person? I mean, that can be a writer, it can be a filmmaker, it can be an entrepreneur, anyone, right? Anything, any venture or any project that does reasonably well, the first temptation that you have is to do more of the same, right? So I was thinking whether or not to write another business book, right? So Command to Empathy Part 2 and so on till Part 57, right? Or to take up a passion project, to really push myself beyond the comfort zone and say, look, can I learn about something? Can my thinking and understanding of a particular subject evolve even as I'm writing it? That was the kind of challenge that I set myself. And I said, okay, I'm going to do history. And then once that question was decided in my mind that it's going to be history, then the rest was fairly easy in terms of, okay, then it's Mughal history, the interest in Mughal history, and then if it's Mughal history, I knew that it wasn't going to be about a particular sort of broad sweep of era, like an era of darkness, or about something very specific, like a huge event that had monumental impact, like any of the battles of Panipat or the Battle of Plassey. I knew it was going to be about a person. And after that, you only had so many people, and I've said, okay, here's Dara Shikoh, right, who is mentioned, who is influential, who is still talked about controversially, but who hasn't really been written about, certainly not in an engaging, non-academic fashion in over half a century. And that's then when I said, all right, maybe this. And by that time, I had got myself a great literary agent, and then it was very collaborative. So that part was much, much smoother for me than when I was starting out writing Anchor.
Yeah. Can you talk about the process of writing history? You mentioned going to the National Archives and being in, the rare book section, getting access to that. What was this process like? How much time did it take? What did it take out of you? Did you have to? What was your mental place like when you were writing this book?
So this was really like a working sabbatical for me, because I had a couple of sort of consulting projects that I was doing on my own, but a large part of the time was just thinking, trying to get a feel for the subject, for the protagonist, and trying to really empathize with that person, right? Trying to literally put myself metaphorically in that person's shoes, and trying my best to bring that entire sort of milieu, those times to life in as engaging as fashion as I could possibly sort of manage to do. I think in terms of timelines of about 18 to 20 months, all told. So right from the time when I started to write the proposal with Priya Doraiswamy, and then worked collaboratively with my commissioning editor at HarperCollins, Rahul Soni, till it went to print, right? So that was, and I think the great thing for me here was it was very collaborative. I had written a proposal before that for the business book, but this one was far more involved, and it actually had a couple of chapters into that. So it was like a big, thick proposal. And Priya helped me develop that, and I got more insights from my discussions with her that, okay, this is what a proposal needs to look like. And as part of the proposal, I had to flesh out like a synopsis, the gist, not just of the book per se, but if I'm going to have 9 chapters in the book, this is roughly what chapter 1 is going to say, and chapter 2 and chapter 3 and thereabouts. So purely in terms of something to go by, like a scaffolding, I had the scaffolding in place, right? And that was a great comfort to me, that if I have the scaffolding in place, then I can start to flesh it out in my own way. If I have a scaffolding in place, I can even go beyond its contours, right? And have little ledges and niches and awnings here and there, right? And you would appreciate this far more than me as a professional architect and designer, that if you have that basic designer scaffolding in place, then you can allow yourself to really go out of its boundaries and flirt around, skirt around a little bit here and there, right? That helped a lot. And I got myself into a kind of routine where I would go to the National Library, and I would go in the morning, right? Because there are a lot of people who come there for research, and not every table out there has the power cord where you can just plug in your laptop, right? And so I had to be in by like 9:30. So there were mechanics of this, right? There's the psychology of this as well, right? So I have to get in before those research students get in. So I get in at 9, right? And then they're just about to open it up, right? And I've deposited my bag, and I've got my laptop out, and I've got my card, and I've got my bottle of water and everything else, right? And then they open the door, and I'm just like rushing in. So I have a favorite spot. And I just sort of perch myself down, and then the rest of the day it's just seeping myself more and more into just that atmosphere. It's a phenomenal building. I mean, even though this is the new one, the Pasha Bhavan where I was working, not the old one, which is again being renovated, and now as hopefully post-COVID will be back in circulation again. Yeah, it was just soaking in that atmosphere and letting the atmosphere, letting the place and the feel of the place talk to me and reassure me. And just be there with me, saying, yeah, this is nice, you can do it.
Amazing. I mean, to take sort of take courage and to move out of your comfort zone and in mid-career and say, okay, I'm going to write a historical novel. I mean, it's a historical book biography.
That was
actually very, sort of going back and almost becoming a student once again. I mean, I think that's. Mm-hmm. It takes a certain kind of courage, confidence, and not least ability to do this. It's not as easy as you make it sound. It's not just about showing up early to the National Archives and saying, okay, I'm going to come and sit and write a book on history.
I think Khusru, it's a question of developing the right mindset. And I'm again, sorry, sort of going into pop psychology, but it's the right mindset that you have to develop, which of course, the evolution of that mindset takes time, and you have sort of trips and hurdles and falls along the way. But once you are in that new kind of a zone, then you're far less afraid, because you're intrinsically not afraid of failure. Then you can venture out more, then you can do a lot of things. And I'll give you another example. So I was talking to this friend of mine, school friend of mine, called Deepak Banerjee, and he is a biostatistician, he's an epidemiologist, and he was saying, okay, can we write a book together around the elections? And I was like, or something else as well, right? And I was like, okay, but I don't know about that subject. And he was like, look, we just have this one life, right? And it may not be in your comfort zone. It may or may not be in mine. And we're thinking of roping in another person, another friend of mine from my end school, college days, Bando, who's been on our program, one of the previous Candid Talks. And we said, okay, can we just experiment? Can we just do it for the fun of it? Here is a professional statistician, who is Sudipto. Here is Bando, who's a professional economist. And here is a professional all-purpose handyman, who is Avik, right? Get the three of them collaborate and do something creative and interesting. And he said, people don't do this, so let's do it. I was like, okay.
Brilliant. Is that what Nuva Elent is about?
No. So this is going to be a book that we'll write, and Nuva is a startup, which is another passion project of mine.
So let's talk about we've talked about your past. Let's talk about the future. So we don't have too much time. I'm pretty my eyes one of my eyes is on the clock. So we've got a few minutes left, unless we can overshoot. But we've got so much to talk about that it'll be another hour easily if we were to overshoot. So you talk about two things. One is you say that you have an interest in the future of work, and one of my deep interest is future studies, future you know future of our planet, of our way of doing things. And so what can you elaborate a little bit? Early in the lockdown, there was an interview, a podcast interview with Matt Mullenweg, who's the founder of WordPress, titled "The Future of Work," and he talks about how they've spread. Their office, WordPress, has 1,500 employees all over the world in different time zones. No, they don't even have an office. And so that's just one. That's the physical future of work. What is your specific insight, or what insights do you have? What do you think work is going to be coming up for a lot of us?
So mine is maybe far more sort of specific, right? So take individual sectors, for example. So if you're talking about travel, right, and there's that's hugely disrupted, but sooner or later it's going to pick up again. And one of the things that interests me really is whatever is happening today, in order to maintain social distancing, in order to cater to the basic safety and sort of health regulations, is that going to go away, or is that going to become a norm? And if that becomes a norm, with more and more automated places replacing people, then how's that dynamic going to play out, right? So for example, if you're talking about airport travel, and many of the international airports have this, where you have a touchless screen, right? And many of them have safety measures. And I'm sure if Ruby, when she's watching, she's made a trip recently from flying in from the US to Sweden. A lot of the earlier sort of teller machines and the people behind the counter greeting you and talking to you is going away. So there's that entire human interaction that was there, which may permanently have taken up more time, sure, but there was human interaction that's going away in the aim, right, in the service of safety, in the service of more expeditious processing. And you have a machine, and you can get your boarding pass and everything else, right? Similarly, this week, when in London, in the metro railways, they've tightened the procedures again, the safety procedures again. It's like on off for them, right? Throughout this period. And what's happening now, and they've piloted that across a few of the metro stations, and they have a robot which is coming in and cleaning that entire floor, right? So it's far more than a person going out there, we're wearing those overalls, those brightly colored overalls, and doing the sweep, etc., right? That we have visions of, those of us who've visited London and taken a look. So when we get beyond the COVID, right, think about little things, or not so little things. Think about people who are cleaning. Think about people who are giving us the tickets, or how the ticketing process is happening every time we take a flight out, right? How is that going to change, and how is the definition of work or business that's running going to change as a result of that? And as a fallout of that, what's happening to those people? What are the other kind of opportunities that they can go in for? What, and again, behavioral attributes. If they have to change from being a cleaner to being, let's say, a carer, right? Let's say healthcare, they have to change track from being a cleaner to a carer. I can't have the same set of skills suddenly being a cleaner to being a carer.
Yeah.
Right? Because the cleaning in a hospital can be done by the robot. But I hope that for some time to come, the carer will still be a human being. How do I
empathy again?
Yeah. So how do I move the needle?
April, May, June, I think these were 3 months of unprecedented. It was an unprecedented global phenomenon. I don't think we were ever connected. The entire world was ever so connected, in the sense that we were all doing the same thing, which was not much. But there was a lot of mental, emotional churning going on when we were at home. And I think that time has affected many people in many different ways. How was that time for you, and what were your takeaways from? Did you have any insights from that? Do you have any insights, personal insights for yourself from that time?
Yes, I mean, like so many other people, and across the board. I mean, they don't have to be entrepreneurs, or solopreneurs, or writers to have gone through this, right? Just about anyone throughout that extended lockdown period, it was really, really hard, right? Because you are used to a particular form of life where you're going out and you're meeting people, right? And from an entrepreneurship standpoint, even if that does not readily translate into a new deal or into new business, it's the very fact of it, it's the very connect by definition that gives you that mental or emotional kind of satisfactions and high, right? So all of that goes out of the way, and to be replaced with sort of alienation and loneliness and everything else that psychologists have been talking about over the past few months. I went through that as well, and of course the lockdown, purely from a business standpoint, meant that everything literally was shut down, right? And I'm the kind of person, and I'm sure that comes out, who likes to be in the midst of things, who likes to be doing a lot of things, hopefully with some end in goal, not just activity for the sake of it, but being engaged in things which I personally find sort of fruitful or meaningful. And that was very difficult to do. It was very difficult for people to just get onto a call and hear me out and talk business, or talk about a venture, or talk about a project, or talk about doing anything, right? One of the things that definitely helped was the writing part, because I had a new book project, and I said, okay, you know what, I may not get this time, and I didn't know, how at that point of time we all kind of thought and hoped and prayed it would be like a 3-4 month affair, and then come autumn it'll be better. And I said, okay, let me get started on that, right? So that was one part, and the second part was doing a lot of things online. So starting to teach online, exactly what I'm doing right now. This was one of the main things that I started to do. Curate sessions, curate Candid
Yeah.
Talk, curate events for NASCOM, and just going and putting myself out there and saying, okay, I'm still around, right? I'm available. I can be of use to you, and then figuring out how it is that I can be of use to people.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that people faced was a crisis of relevance almost, in the lockdown. Am I relevant anymore? Am I purposeful anymore? Am I meaningful? Is my life going to be purposeful and meaningful anymore? I think that shook a lot of people up, and
Yes,
and I
indeed,
think that
indeed.
I think that also it was a reflective time, where people were really reconsidering a lot of their established ideas of who they were, what their role in life was, and
Hmm, hmm.
yeah. Avik, let's talk about a few more minutes. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's
So
talk
Khusru,
about.
what I was thinking was, and we've had sessions where we've overshot by a fair bit, so that's not a problem. I was just
Okay,
wondering if you're okay, because I think at the back end, Akash and Anitesh and others already have a few questions. So
sure,
maybe we can just have a few of them on the screen for us to talk through. Maybe
sure.
just a few of
I'm
them,
okay
and
with
then we
that.
can wrap up. Yeah. So
Sure.
Akash, go for it. Ooh, okay, right. Um, Okay, what attracted to me to the subject? Let me be very honest, Ishani. I did not have anything in mind that I'm going to take this really large problem in the world and this question, and I'm going to make it my life's mission to answer it. It really wasn't that. I wanted to study economics because at that point of time it was really cool to do that, to be doing economics at Pressy, um, and that's just one part of the answer. But essentially, I thought that it would give me a sort of more well-rounded, sort of broader perspective across various things. Because economics, right, in its current shape and form, and this has been the case, it's been evolving, right? So you're looking about behavioral economics, you're looking about political economics, you're looking at the economics of law. So it transcends and it overlaps across so many other disciplines, right? And I think across history, we have developmental economics, economic history, and I think one of the things that really attracted to me was the breadth of its solution, just the sheer breadth of its outreach. And I think I wanted to have maybe a flavor of that. Yeah, I think we've discussed this one, right? Particularly people in my maternal side of the family who are historians and academics, and that's what took me to history and then to Dara Shikoh. Yeah, maybe another question. Ooh, okay. That's an interesting one. That's a very interesting one. Well, this is really great, Venkatesh. Thank you so much for that question. So let me be quite candid in the spirit of the Candid Talks. I was really trying to reach Dara Shikoh at a very intrinsic level. So Dara Shikoh was a poet in his own right. He has his own divan called Iksar-e-Azam. And because I had dabbled with and managed to publish some poetry back in the day, I was trying to approach his poetry experientially, not from an academic's eye. And I know certain very, very sort of senior Puritan academics have taken sort of umbrage and saying, okay, no, this is, you've gone beyond the remit of the historical academic and you've gone into imagined moorings and psychological moorings into the character. But that is exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to use my limited experience as somebody who had published poetry to try and understand what a Mughal prince writing poetry would be. And then, of course, reference that, supplement that with translations from Iksar-e-Azam done by Kalikaranjan Kanungo, Bikramjit Hazrat, and many of the other people. Similarly, when one is talking about his deep theological impact, right? And I'm nowhere near a thinker. I cannot in this birth or maybe in the next touch the level of the deeply pluralistic syncretic thinking that Dara Shikoh had evolved and really had devised as a kind of mission or project. But things like mindfulness had become or had been in recent years important to me. So things like meditation had been important in my life. So again, I was trying to use my experience of meditating and try to understand what Dara would have felt like when he's not just meditating, but he's writing about the form or the process of meditation. So it was very, very experiential. So yes.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. Um, we'll wrap with a couple of questions from my end, Avik. So tell us about how do you say it? Nuva Elint? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, it's Nuva, and what we thought was, okay, this is positive psychology, and this is
So this just for the sake of the viewers. This is Avik's latest startup. It's his new entrepreneurial startup. Avik, tell us about it.
So basically, it's on the face of it, right? It's a psychometric platform that can allow you. So if you're doing that, you just log on to that. You get a user ID and password on any mobile device. It's online. It's digital. It's device independent, and then you can get a very deep sort of profiling across 35 different parameters about your own behavioral characteristics. Right? That's the very sort of broad, bare, dry way of saying that. I think a more interesting way of saying that is it is talking about positive psychology. I mean, there's a huge number of psychometrics, and most of that really relates to the disease model. And the disease model is, if you're a doctor and I'm your patient, you're not going to talk to me about Dara Shikoh. You're not going to talk to me about any of my books or entrepreneurs or anything else. The first thing, even if it's a video online consultation, you're going to ask me, Avik, what's the problem? So your premise is Avik is talking to me because he has a problem. So what's the symptom? Let me gauge the symptom. Let me do my diagnosis. Let me have the medication in place. And then there's cure or remission, right? So there is the basic premise, the supposition, the basic assumption is I am in a place of lack, want, misery, sadness, something negative. And I can move that needle to something which is zero. The whole question is, how do I move it from zero to positive? That is where positive psychology comes in, right? And what we have done is that we have leveraged the advances and the application of positive psychology in the real life, and we've got this platform. So as a result, if you were taking this, Khusru, essentially you would take the test, which takes anything like 25, 30 minutes. And you would get one component of the report, which is talking about your intrinsic potential. All of the discourse, and much of the discourse, talks about, okay, this is what you're not very good at, Avik. This is where HR can help you. This is where you need to learn. This is where you need to move the needle, etc. There is very little talk about this is what I'm really good at. And sometimes it's important purely from the perspective, not just of reinforcement, but of self-awareness. I may have forgotten what I'm genuinely good at, right? Because of the daily grind that we go through in our personal lives and professional lives, and very fast-paced lives that we lead. So just to reorient ourselves, to turn the compass back and say, look, these are your strengths, to hold a mirror in front of that person, and then marry that off with the demonstrated behaviors, the manifested behaviors on the ground, and then going to some very niche sort of attributes. So what is your state of mind like at the moment, right? In terms of anxiety or optimism or pessimism, or how prone are you to depression? What's your resilience? We talked about resilience earlier. What's your level of resilience like? What's your level of self-esteem like? What's your level of grit like? In this lockdown kind of lockdown, unlock kind of a paradigm, are you still high on social or emotional intelligence? That is what you get at the end of the day. And it's early days yet, but we've got a fair bit of traction. So I'm happy. I'm optimistic.
Great. Since you brought up resilience, Avik, I can't resist. I'm tired of being resilient. Most of India is tired of being resilient. We've been asked to be resilient for the last, many months, probably a couple of years now. How long do you think we need to continue to be resilient? And is you're an economist? What's your take on how things going to change? How are they going to change? What's happening next for the Indian economy?
Oh, that's a very deep question for a top economist. I'm definitely not that. Okay, so what I think, and I don't have any crystal ball, but what I do think is that we are in this for the long haul. Because even if the vaccine comes out, even the best case scenario, we're still looking at a number of months before it's available in front of the general public. And I think for every person individually, as well as for institutes, for corporates, for the government agencies, it's really the time to realize that, look, and it's not as if people haven't been doing it, but just revisit the entire rubric of life and of work as we know it, and to revisit that and to say, okay, what is the best that I can do in this kind of a scenario, and have a kind of plan, if you will. Not that plans can't go out the next day, because suddenly the flat where I'm living in is surrounded by a number of people who've suddenly tested positive, and automatically becomes a containment zone, and then even my limited mobility is then stunted. But yes, to have that kernel of optimism, I wouldn't call it grit or resilience, just that kernel of optimism, and to look at the silver linings, to just wake up in the morning and say, I'm healthy.
Yeah, a kernel of optimism in rather uncertain times, though. I mean, I don't remember a more uncertain time than what we're going through at this point, and it feels as if we are on a ship which doesn't have proper navigation, and that's, I think, a lot of people are feeling that, and that's something that we really need to deal with.
Khusru, I completely agree with you, and I'm not a professional psychologist, psychiatrist, but the one question that I would ask is, what's the alternative? Right? What's the other choice that I have? So if I do not have a kernel of optimism, what's the alternative to that?
Optimism is great. I mean, yeah.
Then you're looking into the abyss, right? And I can't remember offhand whether it was Dante or Milton, but if you gaze into the abyss for long, the abyss stares back at you.
Optimism is the only choice we have at this point, Avik. Avik, I'm going to end with one last question. We've had this fascinating conversation. What is happiness to you?
Whew. That's a tricky one. I think this has come to me very late in life, right? Where it's taken me the hindsight of years to look back and to realize that happiness isn't necessarily a set of achievements, but it's more a state of being. It's more when I just wake up in the morning and feel good about myself and feel good about the day and feel good about things that I'm going to do tomorrow. They may be, big things. They may be very, very interesting things. I'm moderating a session for NASCOM, where I'm helping to highlight and showcase the success and journey of some startups, or working on the book, or whatever. Or it just may be, meditating, or it may be avoiding too much of news, which can be very negative, right? Just the little things, just looking forward to the day, I think is a very important component for me of what happiness means, what it constitutes.
And as a follow up, I mean, where does success, or what is the meaning of success for you? What would you consider to be successful for you on a personal level?
When I've made a difference, when I've made an impact. So let's say, so for example, right, with this particular startup, right, I intend to make an impact at the level of the educational institutes, in the lives of individual people, and also businesses at a B2B kind of a level. With Dara Shukor, I just wanted to bring Dara Shukor, as it were, and that was a huge project that I had in mind, of course, right? How can I write about this extremely interesting, complex person in an accessible, engaging manner that people will want to read about him and will want to know about this person and about Mughal history, right? So if that has happened, and you can say, yes, sales is an indicator, or being on the bestsellers list is an indicator, or the press or the reviews is an indicator, or the kind of people that's an indicator, or when I have a conversation with Ruby and she says, you know what, I got your book very late, but I really liked it, and she spends time and she takes time out of her very busy schedule to discuss the book with me. Definitely that's success as well. But essentially, right, if people want to read that book, then I'm happy. That's success.
Thanks, Avik. This was fascinating to hear your story, to share this hour and a little bit with you. And I'm sure your viewers, the many, many hundreds of people who have been following your Candid Talks over the last few months, I hope they're happy to get to know you a little bit more, and that we've had this conversation.
Thank you so much, Khusru, for doing this.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks
hope
for
to get
having
you
me on
back
your show.
soon. So maybe in some of the in one of the future ones, we'll get you on as a panelist, and it'll be me asking you some questions around the
That'd be
loft,
fun.
around your work. Yeah,
Sure.
that will be fun. And viewers, hope you enjoyed this little reversal of roles. Thank you all very much for taking time off your schedule, and we'll be back again very soon with another episode of Candid Talks. Till then, stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.